You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
It never ceases to amaze me that people who subscribe to the Dixie Heritage newsletter, authors, politicians, celebrities, athletes, political activists, people who are active in heritage organizations, people who are the leaders of heritage organizations. And I often get emails from people, and I say this because maybe you're a politician, maybe you're running for public office, maybe you've written a book, maybe you're making an independent film, or maybe you're a celebrity of the more conventional type. I know last year Burt Reynolds made a brief appearance on our show, and John Schneider made an appearance last year. I made a few appearances, actually, as recently Hollywood actor Rick Hurst appeared on the show recently. So maybe you're a more conventional celebrity, or maybe you're just out there doing something great. Maybe you're out there preserving monuments, or you're on the front line of the battle in the culture war somewhere, and you want to get on the radio show and you want to talk about it. And if that's you, I want you to reach out to me. I want you to send me an email. My email address is director@dixieheritage.net. Once again, director@dixieheritage.net. And just tell me why you want to be on the Dixie Heritage Show, and there's a good chance that I'll probably call you back and we'll probably do an interview. Worst case scenario, we pass. But if you want to be on this show, I want you to reach out to me. That said, our guest today, Karl Priest, sent me an email. But when he sent me that email, he was not trying to get on the show. He just wanted to relate something that I had written in a previous issue of the Dixie Heritage newsletter to an event that he was an integral player in back in 1974. And that was the West Virginia textbook protests that ended up going nationwide, an event that some people say were the first shots fired in what we now know as the Culture War. When you think of the first shots fired in a war, there are historians that debate whether or not the first shots of the war between the states were really fired at Fort Sumter, or if maybe they were fired somewhere else before that. And that will always remain debatable. But what is not debatable is that Fort Sumter was a pivotal moment in history. It's the same thing with Lexington Green and the Battle of Lexington. Some would argue that those were the first shots fired in the Revolutionary War. Others would say the war had already begun. But what nobody is debating is that the events of that day on Lexington Green were pivotal to our nation's history. And it's the same with that textbook war of 1974. Were they the first shots that were fired in the Culture War? Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But it was a catalyst. And it was a pivotal moment in our nation's history, one that its details, and more specifically, its warriors, should not be forgotten. I immediately reached out to Karl. I said, Karl, come on the radio, tell the story. And he very graciously agreed. And so the rest of this broadcast will be an interview with 30-year West Virginia educator, school principal, Karl Priest. You had sent me an email, and you had kind of explained to me that you were involved in one of the nation's largest textbook battles.
As far as I know, it was the largest. It involved several thousand people, shut down the state of West Virginia's largest county school system, which had around 28,000 students. And that was in 1974.
And how did you come to be a part of this battle?
Well, I was a new Christian. I'd been a Christian maybe 5 years when this came about, and I watched it in the news, and I got involved as a teacher.
And so you were teaching in the school system in West Virginia then at the time?
Yes, I was. I was a third-year teacher.
And what subject did you teach?
At that time, I was teaching sixth grade, all the subjects.
So I guess maybe we need to go backwards just a little bit. You said on your website that your dad was converted in a rescue mission, and so you grew up in an apartment over the rescue mission.
The first 3 years of my life, I was in that apartment over the rescue mission. Both my parents were part of the rescue, were asked to be caretakers of the children's home summer camp. So we moved to a area still in Charleston, but a little more rural.
Okay. And you said that you were arrested as a kid and then again as an adult.
Well, yes. After we left the summer camp, we moved to a housing project called Orchard Manor, known as West Virginia's South Bronx. And I did have a arrest as I think I was 16 or 17. Thankfully, a Charleston City policeman was the baseball coach, and he helped to make sure that I did not have to go to court. He didn't do anything illegal, but a friend of mine was drinking. We were at a carnival, and he was arrested. And I tried to talk the police officer out of taking him in, and I may have even tried to get the police officer to release his grip from my friend, and I was arrested for interfering with a police officer. But the only thing that became of that was we were taken to the jail, and I was released. I think they kept my friend.
So then what happened when you were arrested as an adult?
As an adult, I just turned 18 and had a job. Well, my mind's blank now, but it's the government program that provides openings for people. You go and fill out an application, and then businesses will hire you. And the company from out of state hired me for passing out samples on a truck, and we started at one end of the county passing out samples and worked our way along for several days. The guy who was leader of the truck, he was from Pittsburgh. They brought in several young guys, I guess were connected to the firm that was passing out the samples. And he was like the foreman of the truck, and he fired the black guy, and he fired me. And I guess he fired me because he didn't want to look like he was discriminating. So the black guy said he was going to go confront the person that fired him. And I went with him, and it ended up in a fist fight. And later on, I was called by the police to turn myself in, which I did. That time I was put in a cell for a while in South Charleston, released on bond, and I had to go to court and was put on 6 months probation.
So what kind of samples were you passing out?
Might have been soap suds. I know we had a bag sort of like a newspaper carriers use, and we would go into a neighborhood, and he would drop us off at different places and come back and get us when the bag was empty.
So I guess after the end of your 6 months probation, I guess you didn't get in any more trouble, and that was the end of it?
That's the last trouble I had with the police until recently. And the police tried to shut me down from passing out literature at a concert. I don't know if you want to hear about that right now.
Oh, we'd love to.
I do have a little post of this on YouTube. My wife and I went to a Christian concert. We didn't go to the concert, but we went outside at the Charleston Civic Center and Coliseum, sponsored by the Mountain Mission, and Mark Lowry was the featured singer. And we were just opening doors for people, and I would hand them literature. I didn't force it on them. That gave the message of why Christians need to get their children out of government schools. Leader of the Mountain Mission, someone must have complained to him. I'm guessing, and I think it's a reasonable guess, that I had handed a tract to a public school teacher, but somebody complained to him, and he told me to stop, and I told him I had a right to do it. And he called the police. The police came and ran me off. Later, talking to the city attorney, I found out the police were wrong, but that's that story.
How recently was that?
That was less than a year ago.
So then you're still very active on the education front then, as far as trying to expose some of just the liberalism and just the bad science and misinformation that's in the public school system.
I actually don't fight the public school system with evolutionism anymore or true science. I got lots of interesting stories to tell you about that, but I've proved beyond a doubt that the public schools can't be redeemed. They won't even allow non-creation, purely scientific facts that challenge evolution to be used or provided to the students. Now I focus on trying to talk Christians into, or not talk them into it, but to provide them reasons why they need to rescue their children. And Brother Ed, I believe if Christians and conservatives do not remove their children from the public schools, America doesn't have a chance. Every day that goes by, it's less and less of a chance.
So what years were you actually teaching in the public school?
I started in 1972 and I retired in 2005. I substituted 1 year after I retired. Right after the textbook war, I helped establish a Christian school, which went for several years, but I was only there 1 year. I couldn't make a living there, so I went into the public schools as a principal for 3 years. Didn't like it, did the job okay, but I decided I wanted to be a math teacher, and that's what I did the rest of my career.
So when you were the principal of the public school, I would assume that would have been the best position outside of, say, a superintendency, where you could have perhaps attempted the course correction of that ship, if you will. And I'm going to guess that was more of an exercise in frustration than it was any real accomplishment, though.
Well, your assumption's good. I went to a different county. I was very surprised that I actually got hired. Karl County blacklisted me. But I went to a different county. I just served as a principal. I can't say, I'm not trying to say that I was scared to do anything, but there just wasn't an opportunity. When I came back to the public schools, that was part of God's plan also, because I was able to get a job back in Kanawha County. And it's sort of like an ant. If you watch an ant crawl and you put an object in front of it, it keeps crawling, it just changes direction. Well, God kept doing that with me over the years until finally the evolutionism battles broke out. Those made, or at least one of them made national news.
Why do you think it is? Because I know that there are a number of godly people in the public school system. They seem to be totally afraid to say anything, to do anything. Why do you think that is? I mean, I'm not so much asking you how or why liberals were able to overtake the public school system, but why is it that those within it who should be the salt and the light are instead just shell-shocked and silent?
Now, there are fewer and fewer of those teachers. My last years, I worked with some teachers at the school who were vocal Christians and sponsored the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, which was really like a Bible program once a week for the school. But to answer your question, it's a matter of economics. If they buck the system, they'll be fired. I was harassed when I was doing this. Letters were sent to the board and my principal trying to get me fired. Fortunately, and I'll give God the glory more than anything else, they weren't able to do it. I had enough seniority, and I made sure that I didn't blatantly break the law, but I don't think anybody could do anything close to what I did now, and I'm not bragging on myself. I'm just stating the facts.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do.
So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Tell us a little bit then about this textbook battle that happened back in the 70s. I mean, how did that come about, and exactly what was your part in it? What were the details of that whole event?
First of all, your part of the country, Dixie sent us a lady who was named Alice Moore. Have you ever heard of her?
That name is familiar, but I can't think of why right now.
She was from Tennessee, maybe Mississippi. Right now she lives in Tennessee, close to the Mississippi line. True Southern belle. She was married to a pastor who was assigned to a church here in West Virginia in Kanawha County. Around that time, there was a controversy about sex ed in the public schools. I'm almost speechless as I try to describe this because a script writer couldn't have done it better. This lady, Alice Moore, went to some meetings, and she was very, very shy, married at a young age. I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but just a Southern belle is what I call her. And one of the ladies that she was with said, "Why don't you run for the Board of Education?" Alice said she didn't think she'd have a chance. Well, they talked about it, and Alice said, "I'll give it a try." And it was like an hour before the deadline to register to run, and they left the meeting where they were and rushed to the courthouse. She ran for the board, was elected. Sometime later, after she was on the board, she went to a meeting. I think it was out west. It wasn't out in West Virginia. And there was a black, I think he was a retired Air Force colonel who spoke. And he spoke about non-standard English and how it was demeaning to black people to speak that. Well, Alice came back, and we were having an adoption of textbooks, which usually goes on behind the scenes and nobody really cares. And she heard someone mention non-standard English. So she started looking at the books, and she was shocked at what she saw. It was much worse than non-standard English. It was terrible. She had all the books delivered to her house and started reading them and started telling people about them. And I'll stop there. That's how it got started.
And so what happened then as she started telling people the content of the books?
Well, the word started spreading around the county. She was invited to meetings at churches. She brought the books. I even have a post on my YouTube channel of one of the meetings where she was. People started reading the books. Some preachers got involved, and boy, those preachers, I have a great admiration for them. I hope I have time to tell you about them. They had a rally, they had a board meeting. It was pouring the rain. They filled the room, and people outside couldn't get in, and they were standing there with umbrellas with the windows open on the side of the building listening to the board meeting, trying to get the board to listen to them. The board would not listen at the time. It just made people madder. It went on from there with a petition of like 10,000 names was presented to the board, and it was ignored. Some of the board members made statements agreeing with that the content was bad in the books, but there was always the addition, but these are for high school students, or people, I should say, students need to hear different viewpoints. But we found out, for instance, I did a thorough review of the communicating series, which is for elementary schools, that there's all kinds of subtle anti-Christian, anti-American content in those books. What we think is that the powers that be, I don't know if it was an actual conspiracy or just a coincidence, but they chose Kanawha County to try to launch the first assault on taking over America by attacking the children, because it's a no-brainer. If you win the children, you've won the war.
And so why do you think that they would have targeted West Virginia?
I can only guess, and this is a guess. My guess is that we were, I call us the buckle of the Bible Belt. They figured if they could get the books accepted and the buckle of the Bible Belt, it would just go across the nation without any problem. But we blocked them. Unfortunately, we trusted the system, and we proved that that can't be done, because later it got even worse. Have you heard of the movie Indoctrination?
No, sir, I've not.
Well, I highly recommend that to you and your listeners. Exodus Mandate produced that movie. It has some of the scenes of the textbook war, but it also has a video of a board meeting in, I believe it was 2000, in Kanawha County. A parent stood up to read a book, and the president of the board stopped him. He said, I'm paraphrasing what he said, videotaped to show on the television. We can't have that showing on television. And the parent said, well, my daughter is reading this in her literature class. He said, my daughter was blocked from singing Jesus Loves Me in her school concert, but she has to read this. And the parent made a really good point. I don't want to try to quote him right now because I would probably not do him justice. The excerpt of that is also on my YouTube channel. I'm not trying to advertise my YouTube channel. I don't get any money from anything. It's just where people can find out facts of the textbook war and evolutionism battles.
And I would assume that most of the members of the school board in a place like West Virginia are at least church members, if not church goers, and would at least have to pay lip service if they weren't outright believers. And so what would their motivation be? I mean, it would be easier for them, you would think, to just dump the textbooks and make their neighbors happy.
I can only go back to Scripture back in 74. The love of money is the root of all evil, and I'll blame it on money. But I do know this. When I first started the evolutionism battles, one of the board members was a prominent member of a Bible-believing church who told me privately he supported me, but when it came down to supporting me publicly, he would not. Of course, I never called him out for what he did, but he chose, I can only assume he chose money over doing the right thing. Amazingly, a member of the board, Betty Jarvis, who is a member of a liberal Methodist church, took a stand, and she suffered greatly. She was a retired teacher who was put on the board as part of the local teacher union. And after she came out in favor of teaching the truth about science, she was abandoned by the teachers union and didn't get reelected. That's the kind of things they do.
My grandfather, for a number of years, was on the school board in Chicago. I'm going to say that he was ignorant of a lot of things, a whole lot of things. And maybe I'm wrong, and he's dead now, so there's no way to prove what I'm about to say. But I would like to believe that had he been confronted with that type of information, where he would no longer be ignorant of the content of the books. In other words, I believe that through the years he probably approved a lot of things just being ignorant of what he was approving. But I would like to believe that if he had been confronted with those things, that he would have come down on the right side of the issue.
He would have had to have made an individual choice like Betty Jarvis made.
Right. And so I wonder why and how that many people who I would assume would have also done a lot of the things that they did out of ignorance. Well, I'll give you an example. Toward the end of his life, I actually kind of began to expose some things to him. I kind of, started to explain some things to him and ask him some questions. And his response was to not run for the school board anymore. He ended up running for the zoning commission instead.
Well, I see the logic. He knew he'd be beating his head against the wall at the school board. As I say, everybody has to make a choice.
Right. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, there must have been some force that would have pressed itself upon what you would presume to be good people.
Money and pride. And I'll give credit where it's due. When I fought the evolutionism battles, Betty Jarvis supported me, but there was one other board member. By the way, one of the greatest charges, one of the major charges leveled against the textbook protesters were we were racist. Of course, they ignored the county didn't have any black board members and very few, if any, black administrators. But by 2000, there was a black board member who was a retired chemist from a local chemical plant, and he took a stance in my favor because he saw the science. So he made a choice. He and Betty Jarvis were not enough to sway the board vote, but I have to give him credit for doing the right thing. I do not know his religious affiliation.
You know what I find interesting, and this is kind of an aside, and we'll come back to the textbook battle, was that you were a math teacher. and yet you took a great interest in science. And there's another person, I know you'll know his name when I mention it, and he's been a guest on our show in the past, and that's Dr. Kent Hovind. And he was a math teacher who also took a tremendous interest in science and creation, and also has established a ministry doing that. Is there a link between the math and the science, or is this just a coincidence?
Well, that's a good point. I think it was Galileo said math is the language with which God wrote the universe. You can't do science without math. So there's the connection. As far as Brother Hovind goes, he was much more diverse in his scientific interest. My interest was focused on insects. And I did that because my first year as a teacher, I didn't want the children to be bored with science like I was. And it just so happened the 4-H rep came through the school with an entomology project, and she handed out a booklet, and I got it, and I decided to do that. The kids loved it, and I loved it, and that's how I became involved in the creation ministry, but focused on insects. Ken Hovind can talk about just about any area of science. I cannot do that.
So again, we're kind of in an aside here, and I do want to get back to the textbook battle, but you were in Vietnam. You were a Vietnam veteran. You were in the Navy. So did you encounter a lot of insects in Vietnam? Is that where you originally gained your interest in insects, or did that come from another source?
I was not in Vietnam. I was in the Navy during the height of the Vietnam War. The answer to your question is no. Did not have any interest in insects while I was in the Navy or the military.
I just figured the jungles of Vietnam are probably full of insects, but that's just an assumption on my part. I've never been there.
Oh, since you mentioned it, I have a huge collection, and a lot of my prize specimens I have ordered from companies that collect them in what we call rainforest areas like Vietnam, Malaysia, South America, and they have huge and beautiful insects. So I'm sure there are some in Vietnam like that.
So back to the textbook battle. How did that finally end? I know you said that you learned the lesson the hard way, not to trust the system.
Well, let me say this. The coal miners got involved helping us. If it hadn't been for the coal miners, we probably would have fizzled out early on. They started picketing local companies, the city bus garage and other places. They started also shutting down coal mines, which was and is the lifeblood of West Virginia. That got the attention of politicians to give us some attention. It also got nationwide publicity because of that. But what happened was the county offered us what was called a 30-day cooling off period. We would send our kids back to the schools. They would remove the books, and they would have board members select representatives that go through the books. Alice, in her heart, didn't feel that was a good thing to do, but she went along with it. It turned out just to be a con job because the other board members selected people with their point of view who just approved of the book. So let me go off onto the side here. First of all, there were 8 books that were immediately rejected by the board. They were so bad. When Alice tried to get a teacher to read from a book at one of the early meetings, the teacher refused to do it. As far as I know, the tape of that meeting has disappeared, but we do have tapes of other board meetings. Local television stations would not allow certain things from the books to be read because it violated the FCC rules. But back to the 30-day cooling off period, we saw that was a joke. So a splinter group representing the protesters broke off from the main group and compiled a 500-page document citing our objections to the books. See, we weren't just wild-eyed ignoramuses caught up in some type of a frenzy. Most of us were not educated, but we were not stupid. I think you know what I mean. We did read the books, we did study them, we did provide documentation. The result of that 30-day cooling off period is the board decided to let the books go back into the schools, but have a parental permission. There's some controversy there, but even the board admitted that at least 60% of the parents would not sign parental permission slips. We actually think it was much higher. The books pretty much weren't used. That's the time I went on to the Christian school and then into Roane County, so I can't speak firsthand, but secondhand information I got is very few teachers use them. However, as I said, things got worse, and it's really bad now.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed, and that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net and find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about
Say
it.
things got worse. Of course, I know they did. Even the Bible says that wicked men shall wax worse and worse, which is why we see our society devolving, if you will, all around us. But kind of explain, maybe, was there a process to it getting worse, or was there an organization to it getting worse, or is that getting worse just a generalization?
Well, the teachers are products of universities and colleges, and it's common knowledge that they're controlled by liberal leftists, and what the teachers are taught, unless they really have a strong background themselves, they come out and teach to the students. I have on my webpage a page of quotes called They Understand, with irrefutable quotations from people who are opposed to God, the United States, and conservatism, that say the battlefront, I'm paraphrasing, but what they say is unequivocal, the battlefronts for the hearts and minds of children. So it's been a process that's going on. We get more brainwashed students out. They're now called snowflakes. You probably heard recently about the strike, or whatever they called it, over global warming. A lot of public school students walked out of school they have a day of silence for the homosexual community. This just come to my mind while I was still teaching. When I was still teaching, we had faculty senate. That was, the students were dismissed, and we had teacher meetings, and we had one sponsored by the state attorney general's office. It was about bullying. This was in the early 2000s. We first started hearing the term bullying. And by the way, the only students I've seen that were bullied when I was a teacher were either the poor kids, the fat kids, or the holiness Christian kids. There were a couple of students who claimed to be homosexual, and I didn't see them harassed in any way. But back to the faculty senate meeting, they had recruited the two teachers who were the sponsor of the FCA group to be the sponsor of this anti-bullying program for school. This was a middle school I was in. And during the meeting, it became obviously this was just a homosexual agenda, which I brought up, created quite a stir in a faculty meeting, and the two teachers that had been recruited resigned from that position. The program was fought by a local man, Kevin McCoy, who had a ministry to stand up to the homosexual agenda. It's there now. There would be no protection that I know of for a holiness student, the girls that wore the long dresses and the long hair, but anybody that claimed to be homosexual, I don't even like to use the word gay, but that's the term they've co-opted.
Can I tell you why I don't even like the term homosexual?
I use sodomite if I can. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, I do, because sodomite is a biblical word, but I'll tell you specifically why I do not use the term homosexual. And and because you're constantly dealing with the issue and topic of evolution, maybe you would appreciate this, is the sodomites invented the term homosexual because they're basically trying to implant the thought into us, because words do mean things. Sodomy is the next stage in the evolution of man. You got Homo erectus, you've got Homo sapien, now homosexual. And basically, I'm not going to let them own the term.
I had not thought of that. That is a really good point. I try to use sodomite as much as I can. I do use homosexual, but I may back off on that after speaking to you.
It's just one of those things where, the liberals are always trying to own. They're always trying to establish the vocabulary, and I'm always trying to not let them do that.
That's right. They control the language.
If you were to give advice to somebody who was engaged with their local school board or with their local city council or with the government in some way, what would be the advice you would give them based on the experience that you had?
I would beg them not to waste their time or money. It's futile. It won't work. We need to get our kids out. We need to have a plan to help the people that are truly needy. We have churches sitting all week empty. We could help the people who can't afford to homeschool or send their children to a Christian school. We can do it. First, we got to get the pastors, and I'll insert this. I think the problem in America is not politicians, it's pastors. It's in the pulpits. Pastors are not doing what they should do. They think 30 minutes on Sunday morning, and maybe if they have a good, strong church, they'll get the kids Sunday night and on Wednesday. That won't offset 30 hours or more of indoctrination in the public schools. It's a no-brainer. Like Pogo, I think it was Pogo the cartoon said, we met the enemy and he is us.
I can say this, having reviewed textbooks from Abeka and Bob Jones, which they're the primary textbook suppliers for even most Christian schools. And having reviewed some of their textbooks, I don't see a whole lot of difference in them and the public school textbooks that I used when I was growing up going to public school.
Well, maybe when you went to the public schools, they weren't too bad. And I haven't looked at Abeka and Bob Jones recently, but they are, as you said, widely used, but they're not the only ones. There's recently a ministry launched that's a combination of several ministries across the nation called the Christian Education Initiative. Folks can go to a group like that and find out what books, even if they have the Christian name. Common Core is another stealth, maybe not so stealth, outright attempt to have a one world curriculum. Any so-called Christian book that says it's Common Core compatible should not be purchased. You're right. People have to be careful.
I mean, it's not enough to just call something Christian, obviously. One thing that has happened here in Florida is when Governor DeSantis became governor, within days, he had signed an executive order basically doing away with Common Core. And, of course, everybody was shouting glory, hallelujah. Even the lost people were shouting glory, hallelujah. But at the same time, it's to remain in place for 2 years while the Secretary of Education develops something different. And my concern is the something different will be worse than what it's replacing.
Common Core is not going to go away. They'll just change the name. It'll still be there. As I said, it's part of a worldwide curriculum attempt. And I think that ultimately it's one world government is the goal of the powers that be in this movement. So they naturally would want to educate the children in a common curriculum. And that's what Common Core is. It's got a lot of money behind it.
Well, I coach middle school baseball. I know a lot of the teachers in the area, and some of them are, I believe, very good people, and some of them I'll say are just outright heathens. And even the heathens do not like the Common Core.
I have noticed that some liberals have resisted it, and I can't explain that. I think overall, though, the leftist powers that be are supporters of Common Core.
If some of the leftists, and I'm talking about the ones that are marching in the streets and holding up the signs, I think if they actually knew the agenda and the ideology and the thinking of the people behind them, I guess my point being is that I don't know that a lot of what we see as the activists, I don't think that they even comprehend the agenda behind them, or even see, in other words, they see their little part of the picture, or they have been jacked up on something that's got them hyped up enough to go out there and hold a picket sign somewhere, or tear something down or spray paint something. But I don't believe that they comprehend the greater agenda behind even their own movement.
Well, I think there was a term for them. Who was it, Lenin or somebody? Useful idiots.
Yes, maybe that's my point, and I definitely don't think that they can put the puzzle pieces together. Even if they can kind of think they understand their piece of the puzzle, they definitely do not have a clue as to the big picture.
You may very well be right, and I don't want to dominate your interview, but please give me time to talk about the 5 preachers before we run out of time.
Oh, well, let's go ahead and do that then.
Okay, after Alice, the Southern Belle got involved, 5 preachers with totally different personalities, different doctrinal or theologies joined with her. Although Alice did not meet with them, it was just sort of really a grassroots thing. These preachers even butted heads sometimes on what to do, but there were 5 of them. One was Marvin Horn, and he was a truck driver. He was the one that was targeted to be taken out because he sort of rose to the top as far as publicity. I think he was framed, and he ended up spending, I think, 2 years, maybe 3 in prison. I contacted Marvin a few years ago, and I said, Marvin, I'd like to study your case, and I'm going to tell you straight up, if I think you're guilty, that's what I'm going to write. He agreed. He gave me all of the documents he had. I studied them. I even called some former jurors who weren't really friendly with me, but I uncovered every stone I could to try to prove that Marvin was justly convicted, and I concluded that he was framed. That can be read on my website, but I wanted to mention Marvin Horn first. Secondly, and
what did they frame him for? What was he accused of?
Conspiracy. He made some comments which they said were used. It's just rinky-dink stuff.
Well, conspiracy's always a trumped-up charge. It's what they go to when they don't have a real charge to. In other words, when no one's actually committed a crime, they accuse them of conspiracy.
You're right, and that you didn't mean the pun, but trumped up is perfect term. I did want to mention Marvin. He's just a fine man. I had his daughter in the Christian school that I taught. She was just a sweetheart. Her and her sister and Marvin's wife suffered greatly. I hope people will take time to read what I wrote about Marvin Horn and even send him a postcard of encouragement. All of these preachers are getting old now. One of them's already gone. I'll mention him next. Henry Thaxton. He was an accountant. I think he was the only one that had a college education. Another one had, I think, a Bible degree. But Henry Thaxton was just a great guy with a great sense of humor. Then there was Avis Hill. He was a little guy, and he sings a song called Sweet Alice, where he refers to himself, Little Avis. And I have that on my YouTube, the theme song. I hope you'll listen to it. It's really good, and it gives a summary and mountain music of the textbook controversy. But Avis Hill was a plumber. They got after him with the IRS and pretty much caused him to go broke. I also want to add that Avis later on in life made a great ministry to the needy in Florida. The fourth one I want to mention is Ezra Grayley, who was a roofer. And the last one was Charles Quigley. I call him a schoolmaster, and I think he had a Bible degree, but he started a Christian school, was started when the textbook controversy hit. So I call him Alice and the 5 preachers. God used a variety of personalities to bring to the attention of America what was happening. Thank you for letting me mention those guys.
The North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org.
Again, let me say that the video clips of all of them on my YouTube channel, one of them has Ezra Grayley coming out of jail. By the way, all of them were arrested, violating the court injunction of how many pickets could be at the Board of Education. And Ezra spent a night in jail, and the video of him the day he was released is heart-wrenching. I encourage you and your listeners to take a look at that.
So what is your YouTube channel?
I would suggest they go to YouTube and just put in Karl Priest, and it should bring it up. There are videos of the textbook war and evolutionism battles. But there's 10, I think I have 10, maybe 12 videos of the textbook war. Textbook protesters were just men and women, mothers, fathers, blue-collar workers. There was a business and professional group that I was part of, but I call them Norman Rockwell Americans. But they've been maligned and slandered as vicious, violent people. But you see these videos and you'll see the truth. And I have dedicated my research to rebuke every charge that's been labeled against them as violent and evil people. It breaks my heart that they've suffered this, and some of their children are ashamed now because of the slander that's been carried on over the years. I also did a lot of research in the so-called academics that did quote unquote scholarly research about the textbook war, and I found out they oftentimes repeated each other's so-called research. It's a sham. They were the first victims of fake news, and they were major victims of fake news.
That was 45 years ago. Obviously, you're still just as fired up about it today as you were then. Why is that?
I'm fired up because I know these people personally, and I don't like what has been done to them, but also because the forces they stood up against are winning. They're taking the children, and that breaks my heart. Those two things really, really grieve me. The slander on the protesters, the indoctrination on today's children.
So I see that you're busy going to churches and Christian schools. Your presentation on creation and evolution, and doing the seminars and doing the different science experiments and the insect demonstrations and so forth. Tell us just briefly a little bit about that.
Go wherever the doors open, take my insects, and the insects always win, no matter how poorly I speak, because the tiniest gnat is more complicated than the computers you and I are on, more complicated than the biggest supersonic jetliner. God chose insects to confound the wise, to show how foolish they are to deny him as the creator. There's no way the simplest gnat could have evolved. You have to have much more faith to believe that happened than you do have to believe that there was a supreme being. which I bring up this point, the co-discoverer of the DNA molecule, Francis Crick, who's deceased now, he realized it was impossible that code could have come about in the time that the Earth has existed, according to their time, millions of years. Of course, I don't agree with that, but given their millions of years, it's still impossible. So he came up with a theory called panspermia that says aliens seeded the Earth. At least he admitted that evolution on Earth was impossible. That just shows how ridiculous it is. When you don't believe in God, someone else said this, you can believe in anything.
Well, I pastored briefly in Roswell, New Mexico, and so you can imagine some of the people and some of the ideas that I encountered at that time. But I don't know how many of the intelligent design advocates in Roswell tied it to aliens, and of course that's why they all wanted to go do their seminar in Roswell. I guess they figured that if they could say they recorded the seminar in Roswell, New Mexico, they'd sell more DVDs.
That's interesting that you'd say that. By the way, the intelligent design movement does not want to use the word creation or creator. I'm not knocking them for that. But they present the science which destroys evolution. Once evolution is destroyed, you have to go somewhere. You have to go to God or space aliens.
Genesis 1:25. God declared the insects good. Of course, I have an argument with my doctor every time I go in for a checkup or a physical. He tells me that my sodium level is too high, that I need to cut back the salt. And I just remind him that Jesus said salt is good. But most people probably wouldn't think that insects are good things. But Genesis 1:25, you said that God declared the insects to be good.
Yeah, they were called creeping things in the King James Bible, which is what I use. And they are good. Humans could not survive without insects. In my presentation, I've got a picture I got somewhere, probably, a secular source that shows a grocery store normal. And then it shows the grocery store of honeybees become extinct, and most of the shelves in that section were bare. If you start out naming insects that are bad, you're going to have trouble thinking of more than 10. One of the first ones you're going to name is a mosquito, but mosquitoes are part of the food chain. The only time you're bitten by a mosquito, and I think it's due to the curse back in the Garden of Eden, is when a pregnant female needs the protein or the other substance from your blood to develop her eggs. The males and the non-pregnant females just feed on pollen, and they're good pollinators throughout their lives. And as I said, they're an important part of the food chain.
What is your website?
Insectman.us. And if they go on the left column, there's a stack of butterflies. Click on the one that says articles, and they'll see one, thank God for insects, thank God for flies, thank God for ants. Also on the left, below the butterflies is a link to the textbook war information. And very importantly, there's a butterfly to Exodus mandate that'll show people why they need to get their children out of government schools and not waste any more time there. They wouldn't send their children as salt and light to a Muslim church or a brothel, so that excuse doesn't work out for public schools.
Well, I definitely appreciate you being on the show with us today. And
thank you, brother. Good to talk to you.
Sir, God bless. And that is about all the time we are going to have for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. I appreciate Karl Priest being our guest today and telling us the story, reminding us of the actions and the sacrifices of some great patriots. Even though that was 45 years ago, those were great patriotic Americans who put their lives on the line. I mean, losing their businesses, losing their freedom, having been falsely imprisoned, losing their reputations. They put it on the line for their children and for their grandchildren and for the future of our country. And we owe them a debt, and to them we will be forever grateful. I hope that you'll go to Karl's website, www.insectman.us, not only so that you can check out some of the interesting presentations that he has done showing how insects are proof of God's creation, but even more importantly, that you'll go through the website and look at the links there to that 1974 textbook battle, some of the documents that he has up there, some of the videos that he's put up there, and so forth, and so that you'll become a little bit more familiar with what happened at that time in our history. Also would like to encourage you to go to my website, www.dixieheritage.net. Sign up for the free newsletter. You can get it in your email inbox every week, absolutely free of charge, no cost or obligation. just like our guest Karl does. I'd love to send that to you, and when you sign up for the free weekly newsletter, I will also send you an absolutely free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. Our guest during the interview, he had mentioned a folk song, a mountain song, of course, being up there in West Virginia, up in Appalachia, a people who are very much known for their music. And he mentioned a song that was written by one of the principal people, one of those who he referred to as the Five Preachers. And he said that a song kind of became the theme song of what they were doing in that ongoing, in those ongoing textbook protests and so forth. And so I have pulled a copy of that video of that song there from Karl's YouTube page. And so we're going to conclude the broadcast by playing that great song. And so stay tuned for just a couple more minutes and listen to the good old mountain music.
Sweet Alice, little Ava, gray, quickly born. What are you doing in that mountain, stirring up a storm? Don't you know you're rousing people around the USA, right from wrong and God-fearing away? Our bridges fell in, the dams gave way, stripped by a beautiful hill. We turned our cheeks when the bridge fell up, they even blew our steel. Yes, we turned our cheeks 70 times 7, we did not resist, till they came for the souls of our precious ones, and now we're going to resist. Yes, they came for our kids with their dirty books and their one-world plan, but they got us surprised from those mountain folks, 'cause now the Lord set stand. Well, first to come were the miners from the deep dark vales of the earth. They know what it is to trust in the Lord for their every breath. Sweet Alice, little Ava, greatly quickly born. What are you doing in that mountain, stirring up a storm? Don't you know you're rousing people around the USA, telling folks right from wrong and God-fearing way? Next to come was the NEA, the textbook leaders of our land. They said our religion was due to the hill and we needed help and more plans. Well, we always thought our help came from God, Jesus and the Holy Spirit true. As special help, we've had it for years. I believe the NEA's confused. Sweet Alice, little Ava, greatly quickly born. Well, what are you doing in that mountain, stirring up a storm? Don't you know you're rousing people around the USA, telling folks right from wrong and God-fearing way? One night cold night at a school board meeting, superintendent was there. They told Alice Hunt the excitement broke out, this flying everywhere. One choir member hid under a table, but the superintendent went down. Then an angry mountain mama on the nation's face, would you believe that trooper left town? Well, sweet Alice, little Ava, greatly quickly born. Well, what are you doing in that mountain, stirring up a storm? Don't you know you're rousing people around the USA, telling folks right from wrong and God-fearing way? On February 22nd of the Daily World, out spoke the communists. You're a racist, they said, know nothing's true, and you're backed by big business. The books start finding them in a decent education, a break for academic freedom. But what they really mean is read the book, kids, and we'll soon have your nation. Sweet Alice, little Ava, greatly quickly born. Well, what are you doing in that mountain, stirring up a storm? Don't you know you're rousing people around the USA, telling folks right from wrong and God-fearing way? Now, the Supreme Court judges who never voted for way over there in Washington, some folks said they committed treason for the shape our nation's in. You can't play in school, you can kill a baby, you can bust the kids for hours on end. It's okay to fight an undeclared war and find out that men aren't men. Well, sweet Alice, little Ava, greatly quickly born. Well, what are you doing in that mountain, stirring up a storm? Don't you know you're rousing people around the USA, telling folks right from wrong and God-fearing way? Now listen, America, you might give in to the Supreme Court mess, but we're standing for God, children, and country, liberty, and happiness. So if you're a believer, not just a pretender for the Lord Jesus Christ, throw out the dirty book, stand up for the Lord and your child, eternal life. Well, sweet Alice, little Ava, greatly quickly born. Well, what are you doing in that mountain, stirring up a storm? Don't you know you're rousing people around the USA, telling folks right from wrong and God-fearing way? One more, sweet Alice.